Alrighty. Thank you all for being here today. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. As you all know from the last session, I'm an emergency doc. I see patients clinically in Boston in a setting that is generally pretty urban. That's not where everybody lives. And we need to be thinking about the communities all over the world that are impacted by climate change. Today, we're going to be hearing about Indigenous perspectives on climate change and health. And we're going to learn both about what this means for youth and also for elders in the community. I'm joined today by two excellent spokespeople for this issue. Victor is a medical student at Harvard Medical School, is a member of two tribes in the United States, and has been a very vocal explainer of this issue to a lot of different audiences. Amber Rose is a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland whose work focuses on Indigenous environmental health issues. And I think we have a lot to learn from both of them. So to start this off, let's start with youth. Amber Rose, what does it mean to be young in an Indigenous community in a changing world? Where are we? Where are we headed? What can we do?
Thanks. Yep.
Keep that one off.
Sorry, everybody. I'm a youth, but technologically challenged. Thank you, Caleb, for that question. I'd just like to start by saying who I am and where I'm from. So I'm Gumbaynggirr from the mid-north coast of New South Wales in Australia. So that's my place-based context. So when I sort of talk about my experience as a youth in this space, it's really centering my lands and my people and my culture, because that's where I come. That's where I come from. And my ancestors have been connected to our lands. We're saltwater, freshwater people for over 65,000 years. And so I think that in positioning myself in this space, it's really important to draw on the lessons of the past, because we know that they worked. They're time tested. And obviously we're living in a very different time, a very different political, social, economic, cultural landscape. But I think that one of the reasons why everything is quite chaotic and messy at the moment is because we're not valuing these solutions, these knowledges, and these perspectives in the way that we so desperately need. And so when I think about my contribution and my experiences within this space, it's really about how can I honor those that have come before me to fight and to care for a land in such a way that means that I get to enjoy it. Because it wasn't about just surviving or living, it was about philosophical thrival, it was about physical thrival, it was about economic thrival in a way that meant that my, family or my community for 7 generations to come can also enjoy the same fruits of our philosophies and our worldviews. So I think that's a very big answer, but I think it's really about honoring those that have come before in order to place myself now and how I can move forward and create an impact in a very rapidly changing environmental, climate, and health space.
Victor, let's turn to you now to think a little bit about what this means for patients. You're going to be a doctor in a few months, and you have already seen a lot of patients in your career. What does this mean in your community? What is this looking like for youths and others who are impacted by climate change? And how do you think about that as what will be the first physician to come out of your community?
How matakiapi Victor Victor Machiapi Hunkpati Dakota Imataha Nayaki. Hi, my name is Victor. I'm a member of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe in South Dakota, which are known as the Dakota, and I'm also from the Yaqui tribe in Arizona. I'm really honored to be here. I want to say thank you to the organizers, Climate Health Foundation, the people who supported me to get here as well for holding this event and bringing Indigenous voices into this space, which I think are really important. As an Indigenous young person, I grew up seeing, the impacts of climate change on my community. Maybe not necessarily knowing the health impacts as a young Indigenous, boy, but I saw the results of it. I saw my community fighting for our water in the setting of increasing drought, how the policies were impacting our health in this setting as well. I think one of the main things was the stress and the anxiety that my community was facing, that our river was drying up and our people were getting arrested fighting, for the treaties that promised us our land and our water. When during the initial phase of colonization, one of the main things that they wanted to eradicate were our traditional food systems. We ate very, very healthy, and our elders told us that we lived very, very long, usually, over 90 years. And they won't tell you that in the school books when you go to medical school. But we have traditional knowledge that's been passed on, for thousands of years. And when they eradicate our traditional food systems, for instance, the buffalo or the tatanka in our language, our traditional fish, our traditional agriculture, they replaced those things with foods that were very unhealthy: starch, fat, sugar, wheat, things that we never ate before. And these foods were pretty much our community's only option. And in medical school, I heard time and time again, Indigenous people suffer, X amount more from diabetes, from heart disease, but they never told us why, right? They never told us that this history. They didn't teach the medical students that they killed our buffalo near to the point of extinction and gave us these foods that were terrible for our health, and expected us to come back from that, within a matter of decades, and blame it on our lifestyle instead of the impacts of colonization. So I see our patients, as someone who's going to go back to my community. I know this context, I know this history, I know what happened, and I know that as a physician, I'm going to have to advocate not only, helping patients in the clinic as an emergency physician or a pediatrician or wherever I end up, but advocating for my patients on a systematic, on a policy level. Knowing this history, I feel like I have a responsibility to continue that what my ancestors have been doing since colonization. We've been advocating, and whether they knew it or not, they were health advocates as well, because they were fighting for our buffalo, our traditional foods. And when they eradicated those things, that impacted the biodiversity as well. That impacted the climate. So not only did it hurt our climate health on our traditional territories, for instance, buffalo or tatanka are much more sustainable than cows. The way that they fertilize the soil, the way that they eat the plants, the way that they don't require a lot of input that creates a lot of carbon emissions. You don't really need to feed them, right? They live there. They lived there for thousands of years. When they introduced, millions of cattle into the Great Plains, think about all the emissions that creates. And so colonization, I see, is an integral part of the conversation in climate change that's impacting my people's health. And as a physician, I'm taking that perspective forward with me. Thank you.
For the second half of this conversation, I want to turn to elders. I understand both of you have spent some time talking to the elders in your community about climate change, their health, the health of their community. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. We all have read the studies showing that older adults suffer more during heat waves, that older adults with mobility issues die at higher rates during floods and hurricanes. So there's certainly a conversation to be had about vulnerability, but I think there's also a conversation to be had about wisdom. Elders are those who have seen the land change. Elders are those who have seen ecosystems that were healthy and then became unhealthy. What can you share with our audience today about what you have learned in talking to the elders in your community about climate change and our health? Amber Rose, I'll start with you.
So I'll just share a bit of a story about my grandfather. He passed away a few years ago during COVID, and it was really difficult because I wasn't able to go back to his funeral because we were in lockdowns, and so that was a really difficult period for me because I really looked up to him and the lessons that he taught me and the support that he gave me throughout my life to continue my studies. So I kind of keep continuing to study because he was always like, keep going, like, go get him. But I just remember he would speak about things that didn't necessarily seem like we were talking about the climate, but essentially we were, because for us, it's not like a singular experience or phenomenon or change. It's integral to every other facet of our life as Indigenous people. So when he would share stories about how he's seen changes to the way that he would fish, He was known in my community as a legendary fisherman. It's actually on his tombstone. We really wanted to honor that. That was his practice and his way of connecting to country and looking after country, because we're coastal, saltwater, freshwater peoples, so that food source is vital to our health. But he would talk about how, as he got older, his access to those food sources changed, and that was largely due to trawlers in the background. You know, you look out on my country, you look out on my coastal country, and it's beautiful, but you can just see on the horizon all these gigantic, I mean, they look small, but but you see these huge trawlers that are just there, like taking more than they need, and it just mass consumption of our food source. And that's not how we lived. We lived with our fish and with our sharks and with our sea life in a very sustainable way. So much so that actually Gumbangir women had a relationship where we would walk out into the ocean until our about up to our waists, and we would sing out to Gegor, we would sing out to the ocean, and dolphins would actually herd fish in for us and help us catch our food source in that way. So we had a relationship that was so interconnected between our animals and our oceans. And so when he told me that story a few years ago, like right before he passed, it just broke my heart, because it just speaks to how the impacts of displacement of Aboriginal people, the impacts of colonialism, and the impacts of overconsumption is really affecting my communities and my people in ways that is so much more than just the absence of a food source. It's impacting our story, it's impacting our songlines. And so when I hear my elders tell me things like this, and it's not just in our oceans as well, it's in our river systems, it's in our rainforests. You know, on my lands, we have part of our rainforests that actually are still from when Gondwana existed. That's how old our rainforests are. And so it's so important to protect that. And they've seen it being developed. Like just a few months ago, Gumbangir elders had to set up a protest in front of the rainforest because companies were coming in and logging. And so we're constantly dealing with these different kind of assaults on our lands for its resources, because the way that it's being seen is not how we see it. And I really think we need to listen to our old people and to listen to these stories, particularly as, for non-Indigenous people, to understand how we see that, because we don't see it as something that is just, there to take. It's something to live with and to cherish. When I talk about the ocean, when I talk about the dolphins, and when I talk about the rainforest, it's like I'm talking about my grandfather or my mother or my sister, and you care for it just in the way that you would for people. And so we have to get back to that relationship of looking at the environment just as we would those we love.
Thank you for that applause. Thank you for that very powerful set of stories and that very powerful perspective. Victor, you're in a different landscape with a different set of elders. What are their stories? What would you like to share?
Well, I feel very fortunate to have grown up in the Indigenous rights movement. I have two uncles here at COP, and I have one auntie here, and I just, it's been really nice to walk around here and see my elders advocating. And I feel, a lot of Indigenous youth grow up in this fight, and I'm finding my own way to contribute, but I still want to remain connected to, what they're fighting for and their message as a health professional. Our elders, they give us so much wisdom, so much knowledge. And I think one of the things they really want to see is that our Indigenous young people continue these practices, continue these traditions that are time tested. I think, in healthcare, one of the main issues, but there's a divide between, how Indigenous knowledge is a part of this climate health conversation. Sometimes I hear that, maybe it's not as practical as we would like. And our elders are, they're offering very practical solutions. One of them, one of the reasons why I think physicians, should care, based on what my elders have told me, is that, 80% of the remaining biodiversity on Earth is situated within Indigenous territories. What happens if our knowledge isn't passed on that has maintained that? that is the evidence that what we are doing works and that it maintains climate health. If we lose the traditions that Amber Rose, was talking about, that that biodiversity that we've protected is at high risk, and that impacts everyone else, right? That impacts the climate health of the entire planet. And so that's one reason I think that, physicians should care. Indigenous peoples are also, on the front lines in these communities. Our elders are out there fighting, with their lives. I've had many, elder friends, mentors who have been assassinated, who have been, imprisoned without proper cause, or just, brutalized for protecting their forests, protecting their rivers. Every other day I hear about an Indigenous elder who's been killed by, miners or people who who using want the lumber in their land, or who want the oil. And I think our elders in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus is one of the reasons why we're unified in saying we need to phase out the use of fossil fuels in our traditional territories, because they're out there fighting for that. So that's another place where I think, as physicians who maybe are non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples, I think where we can, find common ground, right? And then on the other end, there's this, one of the things that when I spoke to my elders, they talked about this just transition, right? The transition to the use of, solar panels, and electric cars. These things are also impacting our traditional territories, because a lot of the rare earth minerals that they use for these things are still being mined in our traditional territories. And so my elders, that I spoke to for in preparation for this, they took a very practical policy, oriented approach, and said, this is what we want you to talk to the physicians about, because these mines are impacting our health as well. They're bringing in a lot of men from outside of the communities, and we're seeing a rise in sexual violence against our women and Indigenous women and girls. And that's, traumatizing them, and that's creating intergenerational health impacts through intergenerational trauma. And so these, I think, it'd be great if we can get health professionals talking about these things and recognizing them as an important piece of the climate health conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. I think we have less than a minute left. So maybe one thought from you, Amber Rose, on what is something you would like to share with a community, many of whom are not Indigenous, who are in front of you, or at least are Indigenous to other places and other times. What is a lesson that you have learned that you want to share? And then we'll let Victor close the session.
Thanks, Caleb. I think one passing thought would be, I know you care about health. If you care about health, and if you care about climate health, then you also care about Indigenous peoples, because as I was saying before, for us, everything is interconnected. Climate change is a health crisis. Climate change is a human rights crisis. Fundamentally, we need to start figuring out how to address the root causes. People like Victor and I, this is our everyday, because our livelihoods, our life, our culture, our story depends on it. And so we get up every day going into a fight. It looks very different on different days, but the act of living and the act of continuing up the fight of our old people and for our future generations, that is Indigenous advocacy. We only make up globally 6% of the world's population. And as Victor was saying, we protect more than 80% of the planet's remaining biodiversity. You need us, but we also need you. We need you to join the fight. We need you to sit with us. We need you to hear from us. We need you to listen to us. And we need you to fight for and with us, because fundamentally life on Earth depends on it. And so we welcome you, we invite you in to share in that fight, so that we don't have to just carry the load ourselves.
Right. Victor, I will hand you the microphone.
I would say I feel like there's a lot of hope, in the future with the collaboration between Indigenous nations and countries and citizens of countries around the world. I think when our nations can come together and really come together and in a solution-oriented, rights-based approach, I think there's no limit to the good we can do. Indigenous nations are the oldest nations on Earth, thousands of years older than for instance, the United States, Canada. Our languages are the oldest languages on earth. And I think that is evidence that, we have something to give. We've been around the longest, and I think we have a lot to share about how we did that, right? How did these indigenous nations, how are we still here? How do we still have cultures? And how am I still practicing ceremonies that my ancestors practiced, 5,000 years ago? How did we do that? I think that is the traditional knowledge that I think that we can bring into these spaces. And in the modern sense, there's so much good that's coming from innovation, technology. I think there is potential there, but there has to be a rights-based approach to using that. And we can come together and we can create, a future. We can envision something that this is not the end. I think we need to try new things. We need to be courageous. We need to be brave and say, it's not one solution. It's not one indigenous peoples are right or the Western world is right. We both have amazing things to offer. We both have things to work on as well within our own communities. And I think, that gives me a lot of hope that, especially even in a space like this, that we can come together and talk about health specifically. We can do that in a lot of other spaces, and let's see what we can do together.
I think we will close there. All right. Thank you all for your attention. I think we're at time. Do you have anything else? Do you want to share a poem? Share your poem.
They asked me to write a poem. Originally, I'm not a poet, but I guess I am now. I've never read a poem in public, so this is new. Okay, so this poem is called Your Soul Will Hear. You can't tell me climate health is not the place for indigenous peoples. As long as you live with us, as long as we drink from the same watersheds, my indigenous issues are yours. So when I say include our voices, I'm not asking for permission. I am asking you to listen. I am telling you to listen. And yet, I am still met with confusion and sometimes isolating silence. Does it make you uncomfortable? Do your hands sweat? Does your seat start to shake? Does your worldview tremble? Good, it's about time. I have been made uncomfortable for over 130 years. You'll be just fine. So listen carefully as the words of my grandmothers and grandfathers roll off my tongue in a language your soul will hear. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all.